Welcome into the Autzen Audibles Podcast, Mailbag edition. I'm at Prehm and Erik Skopil on the show as always. It's Monday after Oregon's 16-13 victory at Wisconsin. They're 11-0. It's a bye week. It's a time to rest for the entire program. It's a time for rest for us, quite frankly. These road trips are no joke. But for Oregon, 3 of them across the country in like 5 weeks. They're here. They needed this break. And I think a lot of these questions on this mailbag are quite frankly going to be centered kind of around the reset, the move forward. Where can this team take the next step?
Yeah, this is going to be a fun one. We've kind of reached, as Matt said, we've reached a break here where we don't have to talk necessarily about what we've seen on this recent Saturday or what we're seeing on the upcoming Saturday. We can kind of take a step back and kind of have a bird's eye view here. So I thought this was a really fun one to start with from at Robbie Parness, one of our OG MVP question askers. He probably has a very high rate of questions getting on the show. So thank you, Robbie, again. Would you rather win the conference championship and get a first-round bye or lose but have an easier path to the playoff as the number 5 or 6 seed? Hashtag Autzen Audibles. Thank you, Robbie. This is a good question because I'm of two minds on this. And before I kind of break that down, I did want to say something in terms of the conference championship being clinched because I've seen a lot of confusion about this on the internet. Including a couple of sites reporting Oregon did clinch. Talking to Oregon officials, Matt, they have not clinched, is what has been communicated to us. They have not locked up a spot in the Big Ten championship game, and they won't until they beat Washington, is what we were told, essentially. Well, that's not totally true. I guess if Indiana...
It could happen this weekend.
If Indiana beats Ohio State, it clears things up a little bit. But the issue is if it were 4 one-loss teams, and I still lack clarity on some of this, but if there are 4 one-loss teams, Penn State and Oregon, Penn State would go over Oregon because of their win over Washington and Oregon's loss to Washington. Why Oregon beating Ohio State and Penn State losing to Ohio State doesn't supersede that. I haven't gotten great clarity from people we've spoken to, but I do know that's still a possibility. So just keep that in mind. I think it's safe to book travel if you want to go to Indy. I think Oregon's in really good shape to be there in the first week of December, but just wanted to get that out there because I've seen people saying, "Oh, they've clinched, it's over." My understanding is that's not the case.
I do wonder, not to get too far down away from the actual question here, but the tiebreaker scenarios. I wonder if it's just hey, okay, did Oregon and Ohio State play each other? Yes, okay, Oregon won, so they naturally get the tiebreaker there, and then it turns into did Penn State and Oregon play each other? No, okay, now let's find a common opponent. And but then again, I guess I just kind of convinced myself it's still messed up because it would have been Penn State and Oregon both would have played Washington and Oregon would have lost to Washington, but Penn State and Oregon both played Ohio State and Oregon beat Ohio State. So yes,
we're confused. And I'll be honest, the people talking to us about it didn't seem to have like the Oregon, not that I don't want to say the Oregon officials don't understand the tiebreaker because I'm sure they do, but the way it was explained to me, I was still left going, but what about this scenario? What about that scenario? Just know that I think they have to take care of business essentially. And if you win out, which I think there'll be at least 2, maybe 3 score favorites over Washington after the bye week, it's as simple as winning that game and you're in. But just for people who are, I've seen a lot of people saying it was clinched, and from the people we spoke to, it was not the case. I also haven't seen Oregon or the Big Ten tweet or send anything out saying that's taken place. So just be mindful of that. So let's get to this question though, because I think it's a good one from Robbie. Like I said kind of a moment ago, I'm of two minds here because on one hand I go, winning a conference championship is a really big deal. You know what I mean? Like that's super significant in terms of going into a new conference and doing that. I don't know of instances really where that's happened. It's possible it happens, by the way, in the Big 12 this year with Colorado and Arizona State possibly doing it there as well. Someone in the comments can let me know if there's like a really obvious recent example of a team going into a new conference, a power conference in particular, I should say, and winning that conference in its first year. I don't think it happens very often. It certainly doesn't happen in the Big Ten or the SEC, these big programs or these bigger conferences, I should say. So I think that would be really significant for establishing dominance in this conference, for conveying the message of like, we're not just coming in here to try to compete. We're coming in here to do the whole thing. And being the number one overall seed, which they would certainly be if they do that, that's a huge kind of benchmark. That would be something to build off of. But the other point, which I think is fair, and we talked about this certainly when we were in Madison over the weekend, Matt, I think there's probably almost an easier path to a certain degree if you're the 5 seed, depending on how the seeding comes out. Because if you end up being like the 5 seed and you're playing 12 seed Georgia or 12 seed Alabama or Ole Miss or something like that, that's tough. But if it's like 12 seed Boise State followed by 4 seed the Big 12 champion, that's a much cleaner path to getting to the semifinals. So like I said, I'm kind of two minds here. I think either one has its pros and cons. But Matt, where's your head at for this? Because I think we kind of talked about some of these scenarios over the weekend.
I thought about this morning when you sent me the questions. And I keep going back to where I've landed to prior to today of I think I would want the fewest games possible to play. Because if you're going to think, hey, we're gonna be a team that's playing for the national championship, you're gonna at some point play an elite team, and you're probably gonna play 2 elite teams. And unfortunately, like if and 2 elite teams, the grind that it's going to create and the wear and tear on the body. I know it's not just a simple 7 days game. You're going to have about 10 to 2 weeks in between these playoff games. But even then, the physicality that comes with the marquee matchups of Oregon versus Ohio State, or in this instance, Oregon versus, let's just say, 5-4, whoever comes out of that. I mean, that could be Ohio State, and that could be Miami. That could be BYU. Yeah. That could be Boise State. Those games back to back will really drain on your depth. And so for me, I think I go back to just don't play in the first round, because that's just another physical game. It's going to be another opportunity for a freak injury or the normal wear and tear on the body. And while Oregon has, knock on wood, relatively been healthy, we have to admit, like, injuries are starting to hit now. Like, Jordan James made it very clear he was playing in this game against Wisconsin afterwards, but it was made very clear by Oregon's coaching staff not to play him in the entire second half outside of one play against Maryland the week before, because it was a load management deal. Like, he's dealing with something that there's enough there where they're like, hey, it's beneficial for him not to play, and we try and win this game without him, than it is playing with him from a long run perspective. Jordan Birch didn't play against Wisconsin, a late scratch. We'll see what the bye week does for him. Justice Lowe is a guy that took a massive hit and was limited in his return. We'll talk on that more. And then, then there's the normal Tez Johnson, Marcus Harper, 2 guys that are probably trending closer to being back. But my reason here is injuries are starting to mount. And the more games you play, the more frequently those will happen. The more frequent reaggravation of an injury will happen. And so I just go back to, who cares? You're going to play elite teams. You're going to play good teams no matter what. Eliminate one of the extra games possible.
And that's good reasoning, too, in terms of, because the way I was kind of framing it before was splitting it between the best odds of winning a national championship opposed to the significance of being the conference champion. You're right, though, and one fewer game is an advantage in and of itself. And even if that sets up maybe a more difficult path towards the end, why are you running from that, in terms of you're going to have to play the good teams to win the national championship anyway?
But I mean, don't get me wrong, though. Like, if Oregon, let's say Oregon does win they beat Washington, and then they win the Big Ten championship, they get the 1 seed, and the next thing you know, they're playing Georgia team that's the 12, who's playing number 5 Ohio State in the opening round, and Oregon has to play the winner of that. Like, yeah, that's completely unfair for the team that went 13-0 across the entire country, and now you have to play what's probably going to be the number 2 or the number 3 team in the polls, but not the seeding, in Ohio State, or the most talented team in college football based on roster, talent from 24/7 Sports and recruiting rankings, and a team that's played for and won the national championship a bunch of times the last 4 years. Like, that's a really crappy draw for the number one team that should theoretically have earned the easiest path of the 12 teams into the college football playoffs.
I think what we're going to come out of this saying is, in this format, there just aren't going to be very many easy paths. But there could be scenarios, and that's where it gets interesting, and we'll move on here in a second. But there could be scenarios and that's why this question is being asked, a 5 or a 6 seed could be more beneficial in terms of the teams you're playing to get there. But again, once you get to like the semifinals and stuff, like you're going to play really good teams no matter what. So it's just a matter of taking advantage. I think you might have convinced me there with the one fewer game. I think especially with the rigors and what we're seeing on a week-to-week basis. And I might even just jump to this question first, just because it's kind of on topic about injuries. But they are starting to mount up. I'm not saying Oregon is completely decimated by any means. Right. There are programs out there in much worse shape. Like Oregon, knock on wood, has been somewhat fortunate. But there are, as we'll get to here right now, and maybe this is a natural transition to a question from @AlSmithPDX. Who is expected back after the bye? Birch, Tez, and did Lowe come back into the game? What is his status? Justice Lowe did come back into the game. He did not play the majority of the snaps after, though. Gary Bryant really kind of filled in as the type of player we thought he'd be maybe entering the season. This was somebody who played a ton last year, and they really kind of relied on him to close this win against the Badgers. But Lowe did come back and play. We don't have any particulars on the status there. I saw somebody ask, I'll just jump into this one, Jamar Caldwell. We thought we were like right behind the end zone. We saw him come down after he deflected the pass that ended up sealing the game that Mateo intercepted. He was on the ground in a lot of pain, Matt, and we thought like, oh boy, that looks pretty gnarly. I did ask Dan afterwards, and his response was, I think he's doing fine. So he kind of undermined the possibility that this is something serious, or at least kind of didn't seem to signal that it was. So that I thought was encouraging, but it's another name to just kind of have in the back of your mind. I saw a couple people ask about that. And then there's the 3 kind of existing ones here with Birch, Tez, and Harper, who were all out for the Wisconsin game. What are you hearing, Matt, on those 3 names? Because I think those are the ones people really want to know about. Lowe and Caldwell, who we just talked about. I think there's kind of some interest there, but those are 2 players that it seems like early returns are positive, but I think there's maybe less clarity on the other 3.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a real high probability that Harper and Tez and probably Jordan are going to be back for the Washington game or the Big Ten championship game. I think with the fact that them all being seniors may open the door for, hey, if we can play them in a limited spot so they can play in their last potential home game at Autzen Stadium and it doesn't really hurt them from a long-term injury perspective, like they may pull it, but it will probably be a situation where they're limited and take your shots with them on the field in short spurts, but keep them healthy so they're ready for the stretch run. But that's kind of the time frame. Like I think all 3 of them are fully expected to be back by playoffs, whether that's December 21st. And this is another instance of why you want to win the Big Ten, because if you get to the Big Ten championship and you still don't have these guys yet, if they're game day decisions and it just doesn't feel right that day, like winning the Big Ten championship on December 8th?
7th, I think. Yeah.
Opens the door for 3 more weeks of rehab before you play again to get these guys available to play. And trust me, like Birch, it wouldn't have surprised me if his scratch against Wisconsin was a day of type deal, or the day before type deal when they boarded the plane on Friday. Like, not to change sports here, but Raheem Moss for Oregon men's basketball team, he hurt his knee in a practice on Friday. Dana Altman said on Sunday morning he woke up, they did their shoot around, and he just went to the coaches and said I can't play. I can't move. I need to be able to move. I'll be ready next week, but I can't move like you want me to. And he was a scratch. That stuff happens, and it's going to factor in, I think, with Birch and Harper and Tez on next Saturday when they play Washington, and then the Big Ten championship game. It's all going to be about how does their body feel this particular week. Can they give it a go? But I think the expectation is all three are back. Now, Caldwell is – I want to believe Dan Lanning, but I also want to believe what my eyes saw. And it literally happened right in front of you and I. And look, he was in a ton of pain. I mean, he was getting tended to and his body was shaking because he was in so much pain. And now to defend Dan's decision of coming out and just saying he's fine, and he's always not been true. Sometimes he's not been the most truthful person in injuries. In the past, we did see a player like in early September go down with an injury at practice, and it was the same type of deal. Like he got hit really hard, and his body was just like he was in so much pain. He was just moving his like limbs to just help kind of spread out the energy that was coming from the injury. And we were like, oh God, he could be done. And he started and he played basically the entire game after that injury happened.
Well, he was back at practice the next day was the thing. I mean, we had been told by some sources that it was pretty nasty and like it was going to be a thing. And it like, can we even, I don't know. It's so far past. I mean, I feel like we can almost say who it is. But maybe,
it was Kobe Savage.
Yeah, it was Kobe Savage. I mean, this happened months ago, so it's not like this is
early September.
Yeah.
And so that's why like you don't speculate because as we're kind of speculating because
we are very much speculating, but that's go ahead.
But those are examples why, because sometimes you see it and you're like, oh, that's really bad, or oh, that shouldn't be bad at all, and it is.
I'm just gonna say on this one, I'll just buy Dan on the Caldwell one.
Yes.
I'm just gonna say I'm gonna stick with it. It looked wild, but I think I'm going to just trust Dan on this particular one, and maybe I'll be proven silly in the next couple of weeks. Just one last thing on the three players. Tez was at this game, which was interesting because I don't think there was a sense he was going to play in it. I did not see Birch or Harper. Now, it's very possible in the massive humanity on that sideline that a guy in probably a big old winter jacket that didn't have his name or his number on it got lost out there. It wouldn't surprise me to find that somebody, and maybe somebody else is out there, has already reported they ID'd Jordan Birch on the sideline. I never got down on the field. I don't normally get on the field. I did my best with my binoculars in the press box to try to find players. I didn't see him. Maybe he was shown on the television broadcast. I still haven't watched the replay. I could sound really silly. I'm just saying from my personal seat up in the press box, I did not see Birch and I did not see Harper. Just kind of notable that Tez was there and those guys weren't. I don't know if that means anything. And again, we'll see what Dan has to say this week. We should note it's bye week. That means no Dan press conference on Monday night. That means no open practices on Tuesday or Wednesday. Dan will speak with us Wednesday after their practice. So the only media availability this week will come sometime in the probably late morning on Wednesday. So that's kind of where we are with that kind of information. And unless you had anything else there, Matt, I want to jump to this next question.
Go for it.
All right, from at KStokes04. With all the news coming out about the NFL wanting Dan, should fans be worried that he might leave? And this is a two-part question because he also asks, what flips or new commits could be happening in the next few weeks? Hashtag Autzen Audibles. By the way, Matt, National Signing Day coming up pretty soon here.
That's how I'm going to be spending my week this week. Preparing for that.
Let's do the first part. This was kind of a hot ticket item, I would say, middle of last week. We have not talked about it on the podcast, part because we were traveling to Wisconsin and covering that football game. But Dan in the NFL, Dan being an attractive candidate for the NFL, not surprised in the slightest that Dan's name is going to be a name for jobs at any level, just because of how highly I think of him and the way he runs a program and what he's been able to do here. And frankly, his disposition and temperament, I think this guy could coach probably any sport at any level and find ways to be highly successful. I think he's one of those guys. My concern level remains pretty low on him bouncing. I do take him at his word in terms of he's got 3 young boys. They've moved all over the country. He and his family seem really settled and comfortable in Eugene. He's made that point before. Maybe I'm too trusting and I'm going to prove to be. It's weird that I'm too trusting because Oregon has been bitten by this twice in the last 6 years while I've been covering this program. But
no coach has made it very clear, though, like he has. The other teams have not.
I know, but now I feel like we're doing the but my girlfriend's different thing. You know what I mean? Where you're like, where your friends are like, oh, but what about? And you're going, I trust me, she's special, she's different, and then it turns out. But I do. I guess I am buying into that. He's charmed me in that way, where I think he's sticking around. But Matt, I know you've kind of also done a little bit of talk on our side about this. What have you heard about this?
It's nothing to buy into right now. I read the report by ESPN, and I think the thing that stood the most out to me was it was a conversation with the reporter asking, like, hey, from an NFL executive standpoint, are there any coaches at the college level that catch your eye? And it was answered Dan Lanning. He's got a lot of Dan Campbell is the
Dan Campbell was that's the comparator, the Lions coach. Yep.
But the funniness there is Dan Campbell, I don't think, has ever coached in college football before.
I think the comparison was more like temperament and mentality as opposed to career tracks.
Sure. But the bigger point was there was no like, hey, I'm hearing Team X is interested in going after Dan Lanning, or we're interested in going after Dan Lanning. It was just, hey, who is a coach that you think could make it at the NFL level? It was, and the coach said, I think probably Dan Lanning. He's similar to the way Dan Campbell has kind of built that culture up at Detroit. Like, those are two far different things. And so I think, first of all, that context is important to know. And second of all, like, the NFL right now, the NFL is significantly easier is not the right word, but like a time commitment and how many hats even as a position coach you have to wear between the NFL and the college level is drastically different. College players or NFL coaches do not have to worry about recruiting. They do not have to worry about NIL management and money. They do not have to worry as much of roster retention, keeping their own players. Like, those are, and we haven't even talked about actual on-field stuff. Those are just things that they have to do compared to the college level. But I feel like Dan is a college coach because how many times does he talk about, I want to serve other people, I want to help other people, I want to bring up and develop young men. He always talks about that. I think that comes back to his parents being teachers, to him starting out originally as a teacher. Those are all common traits with that profession. Not to say NFL coaches don't do those things either, but it's just more profound at the college level. Now, I will say, like, I don't think there's a team in the country right now, college-wise, that Dan would leave to go coach at. He made that, I think, abundantly clear by basically shutting down any kind of Alabama talk last offseason. I do wonder, like, what happens if in 2 or 3 years the Big Red, Andy Reid, retires from the Chiefs. But counter to that is every single NFL coach will want that job because Patrick Mahomes and Kelsey and the group that they've got at Kansas City in place. And while I'm extremely high on Dan Lanning, I think there's probably going to be some more accomplished, more proven guys at the NFL level that will probably be first in line before he is for that job. But if that job were to open, like, to me, that would be the one where he would go against his, I want to keep my family here and every kid graduate from the same high school and we're done moving. Like, that's home. And that's at the highest level too.
Right. And he's made it clear that, not that he would take that job, but he's made it clear, like, that's the team he loves. He grew up, he's a big fan of them. I think he was asked a question at like the last bowl game by the Bull site or something, or maybe it was at a golf tournament this summer. I can't remember. It was like some sort of very PR question that was like, if you could switch jobs with some coach for a day, who would it be? He chose Andy Reid and the Chiefs. So, that's the one vacancy I would be concerned about. I don't know if that's going to open up anytime soon necessarily. He's obviously not being fired. This is like a top 3 all-time coach in NFL history probably. And if they keep winning championships, he just continues to improve his resume. But that did pop to mind. And so maybe, I I don't know. I guess you should be rooting for Oregon quarterbacks Justin Herbert and Bo Nix to take care of business and stop them from winning championships, because maybe he's in a spot where he wants to retire on top. So go Bo and go Justin, who, by the way, had pretty good days on Sunday. It's a fun day of Oregon quarterbacks yesterday. Bo Nix was awesome, and Justin had about as good of a first half, bad of a second half as you can see from one player, but was able to get it done when it mattered most. So let's jump to the second part here. Recruiting. As I said a moment ago, this is going to be a real busy December. Oregon will likely play in the Big Ten championship game on the 7th. They will likely sign a top 10 recruiting class not too long after that, and then likely play in the college football playoff later on in the month. So there's going to be a lot going on, but we haven't talked a ton of recruiting recently. Where do things stand? And to kind of the point here, like who are we thinking Oregon could sign who's not currently on their 25 list?
Yeah, well, from where does Oregon stand right now? 16 verbal commitments. They're still top 10. They're 8th in the country. And I guess it's more so of let's see if Oregon can hold on to some guys first before we dive into who could they add, because Dallas Wilson was at Florida this past weekend, a game in which they came back and beat LSU. Exciting environment, and he's going to be on campus again for an official visit this weekend. I think the hope is for Oregon is to get Dallas Wilson here for the Washington game, but the reality is this has been the guy that's been committed to Oregon the longest. January 17th, 2023 is when he gave a verbal commitment to Oregon, and we've said it from ever since then. It's going to be a long time till National Signing Day, and as you put out earlier, like, signing day now is 3 weeks essentially away. December 4th is the National Signing Day. It's going to be hard to hold on to him. I think the door is still open for it to happen, but if he doesn't make it out to Oregon before that dead period after the Washington game, I don't think it's going to be really likely that he sticks with Oregon's verbal commitment. And that would stink. It's a 5-star guy. It's a top 5 player at the position. And it's a position that Oregon's going to lose a lot of guys. I mean, they could lose 3 of their top 4 receivers this season if Evan Stewart goes pro. Holden and Tez have to move on because they've graduated. But Evan Stewart will be an NFL guy. Does he go or does he come back? What does Gary Bryant Jr. do? Like, he's certainly not shown enough this season because he's just now started to play due to injury to go to the NFL. But does he want a fresh start? Like, I'm not saying he's going to leave, but these are all things that happen that you have to have conversations about in the day and age of college football that we live in.
Sure.
So the reality is Oregon's receiver room is going to be wide open next season, and Dallas Wilson probably had some kind of opportunity to get into the mix. They certainly have Jerion Dickey. They certainly have Kyler Casper. They certainly have Jeremiah McClellan and
Justice Lowe.
Yes. I was going to say a couple of the younger guys to go with Justice Lowe next season.
Yeah,
but
sorry.
The path is still there for Dallas and Decory and Moore, Oregon's 2 5-star receivers to play. So, first of all, hold on to Dallas Wilson. Oregon's 3rd composite 5-star, Brandon Finney. He's from Maryland. He's been at Penn State. He's been at Michigan. He's now open to just basically what am I going to do? He did a story with Brian Don of 24/7 Sports earlier today about I really haven't thought much about my recruitment. I've taken some other visits just to make sure I keep seeing things. But now here in the next couple of weeks, I'm really going to decide what I do. And this is one just like Dallas Wilson, where you're kind of early on, it felt like they had him for good, but now as signing day is getting closer, and this is another guy who plays on the Eastern Seaboard, that's you just kind of go, is this really going to happen? Because he's going to have to fly across the country. Mom and dad are probably coming to the realization hey, that last high school football game of his career is over. It's a new chapter, but it's also possibly the last time we see him play in person on a regular basis. Do we really want this to happen? Does he really want that to happen? So those kind of conversations are starting to pop up. And we should also note, Decory Moore was at a couple visits to other schools, most recently LSU, but he's at least come out and said, like, here, I'm here to see my best friend who's on this team. I'm not going to be taking, I'm not here for LSU. I'm here more so to watch my friend. But of course, LSU is going to say, we don't care. We just want you on campus to be around us, to open that door. I think Trey McNutt was at Florida this past weekend as well, another 4-star commit. So, Oregon's got some guys that are out there and have been on campus at other schools. So first of all, it's secure these 16. Make sure you don't lose any, or you can minimize the numbers that do leave. And maybe it's if Dallas Wilson and Brandon Finney currently look like they're both gone, can you figure out a way to ensure at least one of them sticks? And that should be, if that happens, that should be celebrated. But in terms of who could Oregon flip now, like that list, it's 6 or 7 guys. And honestly, it's going to get bigger because coaching season is starting to trick up a little bit. Phil Longo, the offense coordinator at Wisconsin, got fired last night. And while Oregon certainly isn't targeting a ton of guys that Wisconsin's going at offensively, like more of these decisions are going to start happening across college football, whether that be the position coach getting fired or moving on to another school, or the head coach getting fired or moving on to another school. Like changes will happen, and that's going to open the door for other names to pop up of, well, wait a minute, I was going to play for this guy. He's no longer there. I'm going to take a visit to Oregon late. Names to know, Jaren Kiwa Sagapatuli. I probably butchered it, but JKS.
For listeners, go read the name and tell and understand. It's a tough one. There's a lot of vowels.
JKS from Hawaii, a guy that has kind of had like a very similar quarterback arc to CJ Stroud, where he was a 3-star quarterback as a junior, and as a senior is going to leave probably as a borderline, if not 5-star caliber guy. From Hawaii, Dillon Gabriel is basically his idol, much like Dillon Gabriel's idol was Marcus Mariota. These two had a connection at Elite 11 this summer. They met each other. When JKS was in Eugene, Gabriel was involved in at least a small part of hosting him and showing him around. Hawaii quarterback, currently committed to Cal, but that's just like a standing name only kind of thing right now.
It's a placeholder.
Yes. Georgia has offered. Oregon has certainly offered. He's taken visits to both schools. I think somebody else is getting one. Can't wrap my brain who this weekend. But Oregon's kind of in the driver's seat here. That one feels like the most likely to happen, which is interesting because that would give them 2 QBs. Akili Smith Jr. is also committed. So you kind of have like the legacy kid, and then you've got the like Hawaii Island tradition that's carrying out.
He's also left-handed. We should note there's a little Dillon Gabriel Hawaiian kind of connection, even more so than just being from that place.
Correct. And then I guess probably the most likely one after that, Zach Staskuski from Oregon, an offensive tackle, a Central Catholic player, a guy that Oregon's offered about 2 months ago, has originally committed to Minnesota, and then Washington offered in the summer, and he flipped to the Dogs at the end of summer, and now Oregon offered early into his senior year, and he's flipping, back and forth, I think, between the two schools, and it's probably those two schools that he's really going to be sitting here looking at hard at of can this happen? And it's a position of need. I think the tackle spot would make a lot of sense. And you talk to Alik Terry, and he loves his Pacific Northwest dudes. I mean, you talk about Shaq with him, and you talk about a couple other guys that signed the last couple of years, and he glows about their potential and the big playability that he has. But then when you talk to him about a Fox Crater, and I realize he's from Vancouver, but still same thing. You talk about Devin Brooks. I'm forgetting the third one.
Trent Ferguson.
Trent Ferguson, yes. You talk about those 3 guys, and it just gets different with him. Like, he's super high on those 3 dudes. And he's talked about, like, the Pacific Northwest offensive linemen get overlooked, and in his opinion, and he went back even further of guys that have shown up at Oregon and have played well from the Pacific Northwest. Shane Lemieux, Ryan Walk. I think he threw in Jake Hansen.
Calvin Throckmorton's another guy from
NorCal. And obviously Throckmorton. But he loves these West Coast, Pacific Northwest type dudes, and that's the next one. Caleb Burns is a linebacker committed to Baylor. Baylor did kind of solidify their coaching. They said Dave Aranda is going to come back in 2025, but I always feel like, excuse me, like when a school comes out and publicly says like, hey, we've decided to keep Coach X for next year, like that's basically putting it out there for everybody. Coach X is now on the hot seat because if he doesn't perform next year, he's gone. Like that feels.
Well, you have to put a statement out that for a reason. That's because people are talking about it.
Yes, agreed. That's a linebacker. Oregon needs a linebacker. That's a name to watch. Naeem offered a 5-star cornerback, and this is one kind of where you're like, it feels just kind of like okay, decide, man. Like, what are you doing? Because he's been to Oregon 3 or 4 times. He's been to Auburn 3 or 4 times, and then he continues to say like, oh well, like we really like Ohio State where I'm committed to, like, but we keep wanting to go back to these other 2 schools. So like, we'll see what happens here though. Like it's a 5-star cornerback. You try until he, the ink hits the paper and it gets emailed off to whatever school he ends up signing with. But that's a guy that's in play for Oregon. A 5-star cornerback makes a ton of sense for them to go after, especially if Brandon Finney is no longer committed to Oregon in a couple weeks. We'll see what happens there. Tight end, they've already gotten 1 commitment. They flipped Vander Plug from Washington, but they want more. It's always been the case where they wanted to add 2 guys. Andrew Olesh is a top 5 tight end in the country, currently committed to Michigan, but that feels maybe like Penn State might have the edge. But he was here a couple of weeks ago for an official visit. And then there's Lincoln Cure, the Kansas State commit, I think he's even come out and publicly said, like, I was really close to committing to Oregon. And then I took my Kansas State trip, and that kind of solidified me. He's a K-State in-stater. Yeah. But he's talked all season long about loves Oregon, loves Dan Lanning, loves Drew Maringer, loves the offense, loves everything about the program. We'll take another trip to get out to Eugene before he decides. He was supposed to be here 2 weeks ago, and then it snowed so bad in eastern Colorado and Kansas State that they literally had to shut the interstate down, and he could not get to the airport, which is just mind-boggling to me in 2024. But weather still happens. We'll see if he gets here this weekend or next weekend for a visit. Obviously, adding a 5-star tight end to your group would be tremendous. And then there's a couple other guys out there that aren't committed that are worth watching for. McKay Madsen, a linebacker from California. Jakeem Stewart, obviously, is the big one, the 5-star defensive lineman that reclassed from the 2026 class, who was the number 1 player in the country, to now the 2025 class. Michael Terry is technically still out there, an athlete, another 5-star player. Seems like Oregon's momentum has cooled a little bit there at that position. And, then there's a handful of guys, mostly on the West Coast. Like, I'm real curious what happens, just maybe this isn't Oregon specific, but with Teandre Waverly, he's like a 6'5", 230-pound tight end, H-back, wide receiver, linebacker, edge type guy from the Seattle area. And he's been to Oregon a bunch. He has an offer, and he's got a bunch of big offers, but he hasn't really committed anywhere. He runs track at an elite level. That's one where, like, if Oregon misses on a couple guys and they need to add a body, that's someone where I think you can maybe see Oregon circle back and throw some late attention to into the picture here. But what happens between now and the 3rd, and honestly, maybe after the 3rd, of guys that choose not to sign in that early signing period, could really open the door for a bunch of new names to hit into the board for Oregon from a recruiting standpoint. And then I haven't even talked about the portal yet. This is a long question, long answer, but like, who hits the portal and how much does that impact what Oregon does for the next signing period?
DJ Pickett, is that another name to know? The LSU?
Yeah, I mean, he's talked with Oregon, but it's kind of, I feel like it's one of those where until he comes out and says he's visiting, which I don't think he has. And they're bringing in guys this weekend. There's no game. We know this. There's going to be, would not surprise me in the slightest if there are some secret big name guys that slide through without anyone knowing, because a big thing, what's the easiest way to hide recruits that you don't want anyone to know about that's on campus, whether it's from an interview standpoint, most notably from a guy that's committed elsewhere? Host them on a bye week when there's zero chance that they are exposed to the public area at a football game to get spotted watching the Ducks. Host them on a bye week, and that's this weekend.
One other thing you kind of mentioned there that I ran through all the big dates in December. One thing I didn't acknowledge, which Matt just reminded me of, is that the transfer portal opens on December 9th and runs through basically the end of the month. So it's going to be go from a acquisition perspective in December.
The portal, it's this class, I think originally was going to be really big, but a lot of what's going to happen probably is going to be dependent upon what does an Evan Stewart do, what does a Jordan James do, what does a Derek Harmon do, and then the trickle-down effect of, okay, like does Kyler Casper and Jurion Dickey, like do they sit here and say, I want to play. I'm going to go somewhere where I know I'm going to play. And I didn't single those two guys out because that's what we think is going to happen, but this is an example. Like defensive line, there's a bunch of guys at that spot. And while Caldwell and while Birch and Keon Ware-Hudson are all going to graduate and possibly Derek Harmon goes pro, I think that's probably likely. There's still a bunch of dudes waiting in the wings. And is there an opportunity for one of them to maybe say, like, hey, I just want the path to play, and does that happen? So like portal could also impact how many high school recruits Oregon takes and how many portal guys they take.
And what else is hovering over all of this is the move to 105.
Yeah.
which I don't know if we talked about enough, and that could also impact. We could, I would like to, if we could, try to get Marshall Malco back on the show sometime in December to talk about specific. I don't know how forthcoming they would be, but just like this is, I asked Dan about it at Big Ten Media Day, like the day after the reporting happened from Ross Dellinger at Yahoo. And he gave some insights, but not a ton, and it hasn't really been followed up with much since. So that's another part that there's a lot of things in motion here. So December is going to be a massive month for building, obviously, towards a national championship on the field, but also building up what this team looks like in 2025.
All right, let's take a quick break. We got 3 questions left. Let's dive into that next. All right, welcome back to the Autzen Audibles Podcast. I meant we had 3 questions in, 2 more to go. So math is hard. We're not mathematicians here.
I mean,
it should be easy enough.
I was going to say, I think I could do it. And I was going to correct you and say, I think I've only got 2 left. I was wondering where the third was coming from, but this is a good one here to start. Cause I think I listened back to our podcast right after the game, and there were 2 guys I didn't think we maybe talked enough about. And this was the number one person. This is a question here from @JT. And I think it's just like, I don't know, this is his fax number, 404-916-3972-473. Ton of numbers. And he goes, Atticus Appington needs more credit. Sure, the defense did their part to help win the game, but our kicker came through when it was needed. #Autzen Audibles. 1,000,000%. I don't think we acknowledge it. I know these weren't super long kicks, but how many times have we seen Oregon have issues with even intermediate kicks in big moments of games that end up being costly and either cost you a game or make it so you have to kind of stress and effort a little harder down the stretch, I should say, to win games. And I think it did go under the radar for me. I mean, so much so that I don't think we really talked about it on the show, that he was 3 for 3 on those kicks. Could have been 4 for 4 if not for the fake field goal, but did his job when he was needed to. And, we know through the course of the season that this is a kind of a not a timeshare, but a split between Zappington and Boyle. Boyle's the longer kicker. He's come out there and kicked like the 45 and up kicks, even hit a 50-yarder. We know Sappington's role is to kick the extra points primarily, and then all the shorter field goals. And he was called upon 3 different times in this game, twice in the first quarter, and then obviously with the go-ahead kick in the fourth. And he did his job. He nailed all those kicks. The last one we were on the field for, pretty close, kind of snuck in there. We kind of for a moment were going, oh boy, this would be a tough spot, but he got it done. And I think a lot of credit deserved there. And that's a couple times this year he's been reliable in big moments. And again, historically at Oregon, I don't need to talk too much about it for longtime Oregon fans, but it hasn't always been the case. So good on Atticus for getting it done there and for making those kicks. And I think it did go overlooked a little bit.
Yeah, I think Sappington needed to be praised because we even joked about it during the game of like, oh boy, what's it going to happen if Oregon gets down to the 30-yard line with 1 second left to kick a field goal to win it, or you miss and you go to overtime. What's the confidence level? And I think this program has been so scarred with misses for so long that we've just kind of gravitated towards looking at guys, even when, Sappington hasn't been perfect. I'm not arguing that, but I think he's overall historically been better, or statistically been better than Camden Lewis was. I mean, he's 13 of 15 this season. He's made a 42-yarder. Boyle's made a 50-yarder, and he's 2 of 3. So as a team, they're 15 of 18, and they've made everything from basically 40 yards and in, and that needs to be celebrated because that hasn't been the case the last 6 or so years.
Camden was very up and down. Very up and down, not even year to year, game to game. And so there's a level of reliability here. And it's not that Atticus has been perfect this year. There have been kicks out of bounds. I think he missed an extra point.
He has missed 2 extra points.
2. Okay. Huh.
Which is not acceptable. Like you can't.
Which is not. No. But again, he came up when it needed most. And I also think notable, like I want, for those who are watching the Sunday Night Football game, the Bengals probably win that game if McPherson doesn't miss those 2 field goals in the second half there. I know those were longer kicks, but we're talking in the context of just pressure kicks. One of those came in probably a very similar time of that game against the Chargers last night that McPherson pushed left. Same kind of time, same kind of pressure, obviously different distance, but Atticus was able to get it done. And again, Oregon would have had to find a different way to win this game had he not been able to convert. And obviously, with the way things played out, you probably, if it was a tied game and he missed the first one, you probably end up not faking the field goal for the go-ahead at the end there.
Sure.
But point being, good on him for making those. And the other one that wasn't involved in this question, but I just wanted to note because I saw a couple of people pointed out on social and in the comments section on our podcast on Saturday. Mateo's kind of emergence to stardom was really on display there. Obviously, he had the game decider. He also had a sack that was huge because it followed a play where it looked like Braden Locke threw a left-handed touchdown pass to put Wisconsin up even further. There's a penalty on that play, and then he gets the sack, forces them to kick a field goal. That keeps Oregon within a 1-score game. Obviously, they come down the field later in the fourth quarter and are able to get it all knotted back up. But he was really significant in that game. I don't know if we really appreciated him enough. There was just so many kind of narratives and moving targets to get to in that game that we talked about him a little bit, but maybe not enough. And I just think this has been a very pro Mateo podcast. Like earlier last week, Jared and I talked about, like, could this guy actually be the number 1 overall pick eventually? That was something that his teammate Derek Harmon said to us on, I think, Tuesday or Wednesday of last week. But certainly after this game, a player to be celebrated, especially with Jordan Birch out, just his ability to impact things and be consistent. And again, this is a true sophomore who is really starting to spread his wings and become, I think my point was there's a chance he finishes his career on like the Mount Rushmore of Oregon defensive linemen. There's also a chance he finishes with like the career sack record. I think that's going to take him really finishing this year strong and then putting on a show next year and probably setting a school record for most of the season. But that's the type of player we're seeing emerge here where he's almost to double digits this year. Well, I think quite likely get there with the expanded playoff. And that's puts him in kind of rarefied air. So another player just to shout out here from Saturday's game.
And the thing with Mateo is he has 8.5 sacks this year. He's one off the conference lead of 9.5, which is held by an Indiana defender. And the last time this is what I was doing while you were talking. The last time an Oregon defender led the Pac-12, because this is the first year of the Big Ten.
Led their conference, yeah.
Led their conference in sacks was in 2009 when Kenny Rowe had 11. DeForest Buckner was close in 2015, which is historically funny because that defense was atrocious, and they also had the Defensive Player of the Year in the conference.
Tells you about the other 10 guys in the field, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Kayvon Thibodeau came close to owning the record as well. But 2009 is the last time an Oregon defender led its conference in sacks. And Mateo, the door is now open for it. And I think against Washington, they're going to play a style of football that the opportunities will be present for Oregon to have sack opportunities. And Mateo could get a couple more. And then, what happens in the Big Ten championship game and the playoff games that follow, Oregon, I think, is going to be in a position here where they might have the Big Ten's leader in sacks for the first time for a conference since 2009.
Well, Matt, you mentioned Washington and maybe being an opportunity there. Washington has allowed the 14th most sacks they're the 14th in the Big Ten in sacks allowed. They've allowed 24 in 11 games, so just over 2 per game. So that has not been a strong suit. So you're right. Could be a game where you see him add to that total. Anything else there, or should we jump over to the last one?
Let's just jump to the last one here for a second.
Yeah, sounds good. Let's do it. This one comes from @HuskerDo84. I think Dillon Gabriel has been very good for us, and I also think his lack of size is a big reason for our red zone struggles. Do you think there is a scenario where Dante Moore comes in during some red zone possessions? I included this question to talk about the first half because I don't think the second half has much merit at all. I would be stunned if they go to a 2-quarterback situation, especially
more than stunned.
Yeah, it just isn't going to happen.
I don't know what's beyond it, but that's how I would feel.
Yeah, so no, I don't think that's a scenario that takes place. I don't see that happen with quarterbacks who are in the Heisman Trophy race, even, right? Like, that's definitely not the case. And you don't really see that with experienced quarterbacks going to a younger quarterback, because I would be just as concerned about, even though Dante's maybe 5 or 6 inches taller. I know they're listed 3 inches apart, maybe 4 inches apart, but let's just say maybe Dillon's not actually 6 feet tall, having stood around him several times. But there's going to be other issues I don't necessarily think you trust the true sophomore quarterback more than the 6th-year senior to make the right decisions either. So I know I don't think that's what happens. But I wanted to get into, because I think, I heard this talked about. I've heard this talked about in a couple national podcasts about Oregon, about Dillon's size, and I think that's compelling to me. And you look at what Oregon's done offensively in the red zone this year. They've scored points on 42 out of 49 red zone trips. 4 of those empty trips were because of interceptions. Another one we just saw over the weekend with Ross James being stopped on the fake field goal. I didn't look through and find all the other ones, but my point is more than half of the times they haven't been able to score in the red zone, it's been because of these interceptions. And I do think there are times where he doesn't see the field quite as well as other quarterbacks. And I do think, especially, here's an interesting part of, you think about where those interceptions have happened in terms of on the field. They've been to the boundary. They've been to the sideline, right? They've been throws. Even this one this weekend to Justice was him on an outbreaking route. He throws it behind him, ball's tipped, intercepted. And you obviously think about the ones against Michigan State and UCLA, kind of similar circumstances on at least a couple of those. I think that's because he has a hard time seeing the middle of the field when the field kind of gets condensed like that. Even Matt, we were right on the field there where they had the chance to punch it in on that 3rd and goal, or maybe it was 3rd just outside the goal line, to Terrence Ferguson. And Ferguson had inside position. He was in the right place, and Dillon just didn't put it on him. And that was him standing in the pocket looking over the middle of the field. So I do think while I disagree with the premise that they're ever going to put in Dante Moore, I do think, and this is why I chose the question, I do think there's something to Dillon's inability maybe to see over the middle of the field, where that doesn't hurt you quite as much. When you're 70 yards from the end zone, because maybe you have a little bit more ability to see further down the field. But I don't think he's thrown the ball great when the field has been condensed and in the red zone. I do think that's led to maybe pushing the ball outside more. He's had obviously a lot of success on some of those, if you go look at the touchdowns he has thrown down there. But he's also had a couple where they haven't gone great. So I think there is something to that, and I think that's a good point.
I go back to how many balls has Dillon thrown this season that we've whoa, that's maybe a top 5 throw of the game, or that's his best throw of the game. And I think almost all of them are deep shots or balls where the ball flies through the air 15 or more yards. I can't remember. How long was that Ferguson fourth down catch? I think it was a 25-yard gain or so.
Well, it was 4th and 9. Yeah, it was between 15 and 20, I would guess.
And the other part of this was he was also on scramble drill and on the move, getting out from the pocket and moving towards his left. I think when he has to sit in the pocket and make the short area throws, it's just not his strength. And that's what that throw was to Justice Lowe when he threw an interception. He was kind of still in the pocket. He had to rifle a throw in short, and it was behind Lowe, and ultimately was intercepted. I think every player has a weakness. There is no perfect player in real sport. To find a perfect player, you have to go to Bo Jackson and Tecmo Bowl and play video games. That's how you get the perfect player. Everyone has a weakness. And it feels like for Dillon, it's just when he has to stay in the pocket and throw the short intermediate, stuff. And for Oregon, that doesn't have to be their offense the entire game. But as we've noted, and I think it's a clear trend now, when they get into the red zone, they're probably their best chance of scoring is either the quick zone pass or the screen passes on the outside or some kind of a run play. Because when it's a touchdown that's a pass and you're asking him to kind of weave through the defense and make your read, that's where all the interceptions have come from.
And I will say, we'll wrap it here in a second, but I will say, when you look at the ceiling of Oregon in terms of making a run at a national championship, for the offense specifically, this would be the part of the field I'd be probably most worried about, just because it has not been perfect and he's made some mistakes down there, but also because even when he hasn't turned it over, and we saw this in those two, all three of those drives in the first quarter could have resulted in touchdowns, but they came away with 2 field goals and an interception. And the inability to punch it in when you get it down there, and even again in the fourth quarter where they have to settle for the field goal, where they have to settle for the faked field goal, where they aren't able to get the ball over the goal line with the exception of the Jordan James run. Those are instances where I think you look at it and you say, this is, if you're the opposing team and you can get it to 3rd down and it's a situation where it's a 3rd and a throw, you're a little bit wary of Oregon's ability to score. And if Oregon is going to be the type of team they need to be to win a national championship, they have to be a little bit better down there. And obviously, I'm not trying to say it's been terrible all season, because Oregon's offense has had some really, really nice moments, but there have been some kind of especially on Saturday, in kind of high leverage situations. Oregon put the ball in the red zone a lot against Wisconsin, and they came away with 13 or 16 points in that game. Not certainly could have been more. So yeah, I think that's just a good conversation to have about red zone offense, because I've seen people point the finger a lot of different directions, and I'm sure there are situations where Will Stein doesn't put Oregon and the offense into the best possible situation based upon their scheme. But I think a lot of it is dependent upon some of the quarterback deficiencies in terms of just what he's able to do when facing those situations. So I thought that was a good point that was made by Husker, even though I disagree with the Dante Moore thing.
And we should point out the significance of winning the Big Ten gives you almost 3 full weeks of practice time before the game. Right now, teams they get a bye week this week, and it's an opportunity to really kind of focus in and kind of work on the fundamentals and work on your things. But it's not truly a skill building period. It's let's just keep ourselves sharp. Like they could literally devote a huge chunk of practice or a huge chunk of time for Gabriel to figure out, like, hey, we've got 3 weeks now where we don't have to prepare for a game, prepare for an opponent in its entirety. Let's try and focus in on fixing this. What are we seeing? What are we not working? We can actually dive in and spend time on it. And it's not just Dillon. It'd be other things too. Of being that's the beauty of getting to the first round bye is you can actually now sit here and dissect and work on some things that you haven't been good at in games because you haven't had time to really devote a ton of practice time, 2 or 3 practices to it. All right, that's going to do it for us here on the Autzen Audibles podcast. Thank you for submitting questions as always. We'll be back later this week with some more content. Go to duckterritory.com for more coverage of the Oregon Ducks and all the sports that they're playing. But until the next one, you've been listening to the Autzen Audibles podcast.
Talk to you later, folks.